extracting drugs or coal, although of course the drugs would not be a government pretext. But also, what we found out recently is that an agreement has been made among various organizations and the government and the coal mining companies to make the area around the bay a natural park, both on the land and the water, to be an aquatic preserve, without consulting with us, who are the actual owners of the land.
And Deborah, you're an attorney, and according to the Colombian Constitution, indigenous people have rights on their land. Are you able to exercise those rights and walk up to the organizations that are making this state park and say, you know what, you're on our property?
Bueno, es cierto que nosotros, la Constitución del año 91 reconoció a los pueblos indígenas y también reconoció los resguardos.
It is true that the 1991 Constitution of Colombia recognized indigenous people and their rights over land in their reservation. And the law states that if there's any economic interest that arises surrounding that land, that is for extraction of some resource or some other use for the land that would be commercial, that those of us who are indigenous owners of the land must be consulted for that to be able to go forward.
Y esa consulta previa realmente no se da con los pueblos indígenas. Pero sí nosotros podemos...
Yes, I as a lawyer can appeal to these laws, but in general the laws are not being observed. If I go to the multinational companies or to the government, then it's very unlikely that we will win our case or just be able to persuade them to drop their economic interests because they are just not observing the laws.
Who are some of the groups that are making this state park?
Bueno, hasta ahora tengo conocimiento de una organización que es de acá de Estados Unidos, que es la que está...
Well, there's an organization that's based here in the United States that's called Nature Conservancy that's involved in this agreement. There's also Conservation International. They are working with Nature Conservancy and the Cerrejón mine owners to put together this project of a national park.
And the idea would be that you wouldn't be able to return to your land if it became a national park? That would just be forbidden.
Bueno, realmente nosotros lo que nos preocupa es que el gobierno colombiano se preocupe por hacer...
Well, first of all, we think it's wrong that the government of Colombia has shown so much interest in promoting a national park here on our land without providing for a return. Though we've been appealing for a return for 6 years now, no guarantees of safety have been offered to us, no restitution. And then secondly, there has been no consultation with us as is required by the law. We would actually be happy for a national park to be there. We could live on the land with a park, but of course it would need to be consulted with us so that we could make plans to take care of the land as is needed and to return to it as we've been longing to do. But meanwhile, we continue to suffer hunger and want, especially the families that are living in Maracaibo, Venezuela, in exile.
You're listening to Worldview on WBEZ, Chicago Public Radio. I'm Jerome McDonnell, speaking with Deborah Barros Fince. She's a wayuu indigenous activist from La Guajira in Colombia, and she's the director of Women Weaving Peace. One of the things that's interesting is that there's been an extradition of the person who is accused of being responsible for your family's massacre, and the gentleman, Jorge Quaranta, has been extradited to the United States. Was this a good or a bad thing for you and the people who are his victims?
Bueno, realmente para el proceso de la comunidad de Vallaportete fue negativa, porque unos meses antes era que Jorge Quaranta había reconocido.
For our community, it is resoundingly negative that he was extradited. It happens that just some weeks before the extradition, he had gone public with confirmation that the massacre had happened and that his men had been involved in it. And this was something that was so important for us because the massacre had been denied by the government for so long. As I said, the government had said, oh, it's just a conflict between the Wayuu people. But he confirmed the massacre, and then shortly thereafter, he was taken off to the U.S., and it means that the crimes that were committed against us are not being brought to light, and they remain in complete impunity. There's nobody being punished for that.
Well, why wouldn't extradition to the United States bring out more information? Why is it shutting it down? We always think that Colombian drug leaders are coming to the United States where they can get a fair trial, we can hear the truth.
Bueno, yo creo que frente a eso hay unos errores, porque realmente...
Okay, I think that just reflects an error in understanding. The fact is that Jorge Cuarenta and the 13 others who were extradited with him were brought to the U.S. to be tried on charges of drug trafficking, not on crimes against humanity, the killings and the tortures and the disappearances that they committed against the Colombian people. And I really think, as a lawyer, that they should have been kept in Colombia and have been tried in our courts so that there could have been a full revelation of the truth and they could be held to account for the most serious crimes, which are those crimes against humanity. Those are more serious even than the drug trafficking charges.
Is the fact that he's out of the country, does that mean that there are no more paramilitary groups operating on your land? Or have the paramilitary problems been removed?
Eso es totalmente falso. El hecho que se hayan traído a los máximos comandantes de los paramilitares.
It's completely false to think that, Jerome, because the paramilitary bosses were brought here, but there are many paramilitaries who never demobilized or who just sort of reinvented themselves under a different name that are still operating in our very land of Portete Bay. One of the names which you've probably heard before is Águilas Negras. That's a paramilitary group that continues very active in different parts of Colombia, and they are there.
Can you explain what it's been like for family members to be displaced and moved from Colombia, where you've been living all these years, to somewhere else?
Bueno, sí, de verdad que es muy triste, porque pongo el ejemplo de ayer. Ayer a las 10 de la mañana.
Just yesterday, I got the news that my grandmother, Techo, had died. She is 85 years old, and she was blind, and she passed these last 6 years of her life in great pain. In fact, I believe that she basically died from grief at being removed from the land where she had lived all of her life and having to just be in a different place away from the landscape and the way of life that she had always had.
Donde ella estaba acostumbrada a pastorear sus chivos, donde ella estaba acostumbrada a darle de tomar agüita a los chivos.
I think that she just missed so much being able to take care of her goats and to just walk freely through the desert. She has been living in Maracaibo, Venezuela, closed up in a little house and without any of that freedom to be in her land. This afternoon, her body is going to be brought from Venezuela over to Bahía Portete, to her ancestral land, and buried there. But it's sad that while she's buried there, the rest of us can't live there and take care of her grave.
Thanks very much for joining us. Debora Barros Fince is a wayuu indigenous activist from La Guajira, Colombia, and she's the director of Women Weaving Peace. Thanks very much for joining us and telling us about the circumstances there in Colombia.
Bueno, sí, agradezco mucho a la radio, por Public Radio, por darme la oportunidad.
I am so grateful to Chicago Public Radio for giving me the opportunity to tell the true story of what's happened to the people of Bahía Portete in Colombia.
A couple of the instances that Debora was mentioning there have been the issue that was raised by large human rights groups. There's a new Human Rights Watch report out, and it talks about some of the paramilitaries' errors, and they are the new face of violence in Colombia, according to Human Rights Watch. And their report out in February described how the number of displaced people in Colombia is higher than it was before the supposed demilitarization of paramilitary groups. We're going to put a link to that up on our website at chicagopublicradio.org. Also, Debora mentioned that she couldn't get justice against the man responsible for crimes against her family because he was extradited to the United States. This is not an isolated incident. There was a new report called Truth Behind Bars, Colombian Paramilitary Leaders in the U.S. It was released by Berkeley Law School and their Human Rights Clinic, and it lays out the apparently inadvertent damage that extraditions have done to the cause of truth and justice in Colombia, and it has recommendations for setting things right, so you can link to that on chicagopublicradio.org/worldview.